given that we really didn't, after we decided in second period that we really didn't fully have to get through that, we didn't get through it fully in second period, nor did we get through it in the third period. But, we'll do it tomorrow, so don't worry about that. And that's the last thing on the test. So the first thing on the next test will be the election of 1824, which we'll talk about tomorrow. So now, if we go back to the beginning of this unit, I mean, what we started with was really the election of George Washington and the initiation of the first government. So this unit starts with the election and the initiation of the government under the Constitution. So, we ratified the Constitution, I don't want to say narrowly, but among, some dissent. The Constitution of the United States was ratified by 11 of the 13 states. 2 of the states, North Carolina and Rhode Island, held out that, their ratification for some time after the actual government was launched. But once the Constitution was ratified, the new federal government was in fact going to be launched. An election was held, or elections were held, in November of 1788. And then finally in 1789, the new Congress takes its seat, the first Congress, and the new president had been elected by the Electoral College, and he, Washington, was inaugurated. And a vice president, John Adams, was inaugurated. And Washington and that Congress had to launch the new government as outlined under the Constitution. And we said that there were certain things that they had to do. One of the things that they had to do was give structure to the government. The Constitution was a framework, an outline of government. The details had to be worked out. And one of the details that had to be worked out was the relationship between the departments that Congress created, the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the Department of War, and the secretaries that Washington appointed to head those departments, and Congress and the President. And what we said was that Congress divided government into 3 parts, into 3 departments: Department of State, Department of War, Department of Treasury, and 2 offices: the Office of Attorney General and the Office of Postmaster General. Washington appoints secretaries of state, secretaries of war, secretaries of, or Secretary of Treasury, Attorney General, and Postmaster General, and then begins the practice of meeting with those people for advice. And so one of the things that we argued is that Washington establishes the precedent of a cabinet, right? A cabinet of advisors who are the departmental heads that he appointed and were confirmed by the Senate. Oh, just tell me one person, anybody that was in that first cabinet. It is fairly significant. Alexander, yes? Edmund Randolph, I knew you would pick that. The most obscure, the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. To be contentious, I knew you would pick that. Megan, say a fun one. Alexander Hamilton is a much more fun one. Alexander Hamilton is the Secretary of Treasury. We'll come back to him in a moment. He is the key figure in Washington's first administration. Go ahead, Janet. Thomas Jefferson is Secretary of State, and of course, yes, Henry Knox is the Secretary of War, and this constitutes Washington's first cabinet. And remember, we couldn't remember who the Postmaster General was, but it was probably somebody. Now, we said that's one thing that Washington does. Congress also fills in the structure of government by passing the Judicial Act of 1789. If you remember, the Judicial Act of 1789 kind of creates or gives, structure to the federal judiciary. These are the appellate courts, and these are the, the district courts, and here are the number of Supreme Court justices that will be there, and here is kind of the structure, federal marshals, etc. The entire federal court system is created by the Judicial Act of 1789. Now, jumping ahead a little bit, remember, it is the Judicial Act of 1789 that we mentioned when we talked about that John Marshall is going to declare unconstitutional in the case of Marbury versus Madison. So remember when Marshall takes over as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1801, and later the case of Marbury versus Madison, is heard by Marshall. And Marshall renders a decision, and this is jumping ahead, so when I get there I'll skip it. When Marshall renders that decision, he declares a part of the Judicial Act of 1789 to be unconstitutional. And so that was an act of Congress that Marshall declared to be unconstitutional. Now, just for fun, and I know it's hard to follow this, but just for fun, what part of that act did he declare unconstitutional? Does anybody remember besides Tristan and myself? But go ahead, Tristan. You do not recall. I'm terribly surprised. Yes, go ahead, Alexander. No, that's the precedent that it established. The precedent that it established is that the Supreme Court had the final say of constitutionality. But what part of the Judicial Act was declared unconstitutionality? Unconstitutional, yes. Yes. That piece of legislation gave the Supreme Court the authority to issue writs of mandamus. And what Marshall said is that act exceeded its constitutional authority in doing that. Now, I am jumping ahead, I know that. But I did the Judicial Act of 1789, I go back there, right, to the Judicial Act of 1789. That's also part of filling in the structure of government. Another thing that first government had to do is that first government had to convince the anti-Federalists, those who had opposed the Constitution in the first place, that their liberties would be safe. How is it that they do that? How is it that they do that? How does the first Congress convince the anti-Federalist opposition that their liberties would be safe?
Rachel knows.
Or, dear Rachel, do you know?
Was it...
Of course you do. Yes, go ahead.
Bill of Rights?
Bill of Rights, yes. Right? Remember, a Bill of Rights was demanded by the anti-Federalists. And even people like Jefferson only reluctantly supported the Constitution with the assurance of a Bill of Rights. And so a Bill of Rights is one of the first orders of business of Congress. And remember, the Bill of Rights are amendments to the Constitution. Who is the person that was primarily responsible, Fisher, for kind of shepherding a series of constitutional amendments through Congress and then presenting those constitutional amendments to the state? Who is the father of the Bill of Rights? Not Hamilton. No. Yes. Madison. And remember, eventually, there are 12 amendments that were passed by both houses of Congress. 10 of those 12 amendments were ratified by 3/4 of the states. Now, just, and not on the test, but just for the sake of, civics education, in order to modify the Constitution, an amendment must be approved by 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then those amendments are sent to the individual state legislatures, and 3/4 of those state legislatures have to ratify them. So 12 were sent to the states, 10 were ratified, and those first 10 amendments became what we knew as the Bill of Rights. And there won't be a lot of questions about the Bill of Rights, on the test, kind of just this, what they, their purposes and why they were passed. But the two amendments that we did talk about as being significant were the 9th and the 10th. And there are questions on the test about the 9th and the 10th. Anna Marie, what is your recollection of the 9th and the 10th amendments? You don't have a strong recollection? I will call upon Ricky, who I know has a strong recollection of the 9th and 10th amendments. Ricky, do you have a strong recollection of the 9th and 10th amendments? 10th Amendment, pick either one. Yes, I can barely hear you, but I think what you said was that the 10th Amendment said that any power that is not specifically listed, enumerated, as a power to the federal government diverts to the states. Now, isn't that interesting? And again, this is jumping ahead. It's going to drive you crazy. This is jumping ahead. That this was the big debate, that the Constitution enumerated certain powers that the federal government had. And by definition, some people said if it doesn't say they have it, they don't have it. And if it doesn't say that the Congress has that power, then it automatically goes to the states. But the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution seemed to expand that. And that was problematic for some people. What was the Ninth Amendment? That was a real funky kind of amendment. Remember, this was really Madison's baby, yes. Yes. The Ninth Amendment was intended to make sure that simply because Tony A. Wright was not listed or as a part of the Bill of Rights did not mean that people didn't have that right. And that was important to Madison. Now, we also said that one of the biggest things that the new government had to do was to deal with the financial circumstances of the country. And, you know, the big problem was that the government of the United States, under the Articles of Confederation, was not collecting enough money from the states to finance its bills or to pay its debts. So the nature of the debt is a huge problem, and Hamilton is going to address that problem with his report on public credit. And remember, what comes out of the report on public credit is the proposal to fund the national debt at par, which basically entailed refinancing the national debt at 100% of the face, plus any interest that had been accumulated, and assumption. Now, just real quick, Noah, you are a specialist in Hamilton's financial proposals, I know that. Tell us real quickly, what was assumption? Assumption was more controversial than funding in part. What was assumption?
Was it when the entire country would assume the debts of the individual states?
Well, that's nicely put, yes. What dear Noah said was, it is when, the national government would assume the debts of the states. That those state debts that individual states had accumulated in fighting the revolution would be rolled into a new national debt that would be guaranteed and funded at 100% of its face value. And so assumption is really controversial for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that assumption is so controversial is because it's feared that it's an intent to kind of overwhelm local authority. The problem with Hamilton's financial proposals to people like Madison and Jefferson is that they seemed unfair, whether it was assumption or funding in part, that some people would dramatically benefit by this. The financiers that bought up the debt at less than face value, whether it was state debt or the federal debt, now stood to make a huge windfall. But Hamilton thought that the national debt was a good thing. That a reasonable national debt was a good thing, and that national debt being held by a small group of wealthy financiers and business people wasn't a bad thing either. Why would Hamilton be deterred by the fact that this small group of people, go ahead, Tori.
Was it because they had an interest in the success of the government, so they would make sure it would work?
Yes, that this small group of people this small wealthy and influential group of people had an interest now because they held the debt in making sure that the government worked. And remember, Hamilton was confident in those people that they would have kind of the insight and wherewithal to make sure that the government survived. Now, the other issue that Hamilton addresses is that of a national bank. And, remember, it is Hamilton that kind of vehemently argues that a national bank chartered by the federal government, partially subscribed by the federal government, generally privately run, would be beneficial for the United States. Now, not everyone agreed with that. Not everyone agreed with that in 1791. Some people opposed the national bank on its merits. It's just not a good idea. Other people opposed the national bank because it was suggested that chartering a national bank, in chartering a national bank, Congress exceeded its authority that was outlined in the Constitution. In other words, nowhere did it say that Congress had the authority to charter a bank. And remember, when asked for their opinions, both Randolph and Jefferson agreed that that's true, that the national bank, Congress chartering a national bank, violated the Constitution, was therefore unconstitutional. Hamilton disagreed. Under what clause of the Constitution did Hamilton argue that the bank was constitutional? Go ahead, Meg. the elastic clause, which we discuss again today. Remember, today we said that in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, another thing that would be forward in your notes and is something that I'll skip when I get there, now that I mentioned it now, in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, that John Marshall is going to go back to this question in terms of chartering the second bank of the United States and really reiterate that the loose interpretation, the elastic clause of the Constitution, would enable Congress to do what was necessary and proper to fulfill their regular responsibilities. And a bank would be both necessary and proper. And remember, we argued that that opinion that was articulated by Hamilton and then reinforced by Marshall in 1819 was called the loose interpretation or the broad interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson and Randolph are going to argue for the strict interpretation of the Constitution. If you adhere to the broad interpretation of the Constitution, remember that strengthens the power of the federal government. If you adhere to the strict interpretation of the Constitution, remember that weakens the power of the national government. And given the ideology of Hamilton and Jefferson, it makes sense that both of them would take the positions that they did. Remember, Hamilton was an advocate of a powerful national government that was insulated from the will and the passions of the people. And remember, Jefferson feared that national government would be used as an instrument of tyranny over the people. Well, if you have that general ideology, then the strict interpretation makes sense for Jefferson and the broad interpretation makes sense for Hamilton. Another part of Hamilton's financial proposals were these taxes and excise taxes, tariffs and excise taxes. The most famous was the tax on whiskey, right? And remember, the whiskey tax becomes controversial because so many people defy it. Now, and they refuse to pay it, and they defy the tax. Now, it's not just in Western Pennsylvania. You know, the whiskey tax was defied throughout the frontier. But it is in Western Pennsylvania where Washington and Hamilton decide to exercise the federal government's authority. You know, to try to bring, you know, to force the rebels there to comply and to pay the tax. And remember, Washington's actions in doing that generates a fair amount of controversy. Now, Hamilton's overall financial proposals, whether it was dealing with the national debt, funding it par, assumption, a national bank, and the taxes and tariffs, and his kind of ideology about the role and the power of the federal government generates a response. The opposition to Hamilton's actions begins to coalesce into a political party, an opposition faction, the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is the party that really is created to oppose Hamilton's financial proposals and his actions, and what they perceive as the inappropriate strength and influence of the federal government and the influence of a small number of people over it. Hamilton responds to the growth of Republican opposition by creating his own party that supports the strength and the power of the federal government, and that is the Federalist Party. And this is what emerges in the early 1790s. The emergence of two political factions. The Federalists that supported the strength and power of the federal government and adhered to the ideology of Hamilton, and the Republicans that feared the strength and power of the national government and adhered to the ideology of Jefferson. I don't think this is on the test, but we said that the real distinguishing difference between these factions was the confidence that they had either in the people or in government. Hamilton, was very, not confident in the people, was suspicious of them. Jefferson was confident in the people, and that drifts down into everything else. And one of the things that it drifts down to is a response to the French Revolution. So, one of the things that one might have said, about political parties is they kind of start with domestic affairs. And then they are intensified with foreign affairs, in particular, the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, remember, we said was something that was universally supported, but eventually opposed by the Federalists. Why did the Federalists eventually come out in opposition? Go ahead, Megan. Pardon me? Yes, the reign of terror when the French Revolution degenerated into kind of these mass executions and attacks on, religion. And to Federalists, the chaos that the French Revolution represented was their worst nightmare. I mean, this is what happens when you give the people too much power. And order and stability and the things that keep, society in place, came apart. Deference, religion, etc., and chaos ensued, and the Federalists feared that here. The Republicans focused on liberty, and they were supportive of that, and so there are these differences. But why does it become controversial in the United States itself? How does the French Revolution become a tangible issue in the United States that would divide? Go ahead, Phil.
Because they owe France since they signed
Pardon me?
Because they signed the treaty with them, so they owe France, so they can't.
I worked really hard to hear that. But there's somebody talking in the hall. What did she say? Sam, is that you?
Yes.
What did she say? Yeah, what did she say, Sam?
He said because United States would had to.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's somebody that's distracting me following all I can. And they're louder than you, and they're way out there. All right, so yes, we had a treaty with the French. And when France and England go to war, whether we're going to respect our responsibilities under that treaty becomes controversial. What do we end up doing, Kendall? Do we respect our responsibilities under that treaty, our obligations? What does Washington do that is enormously controversial? Do you recall? In response to this. Okay, what are we going to do? The question is, what are we going to do? Alan, what does he do? Washington does what? What did he say? He proclaimed neutrality. And that proclamation of neutrality really sets forth a series of events that intensifies the political friction. Neutrality is proclaimed, but Citizen Genet arrives. Who is Citizen Genet? We hear questions on the test about him. Who is Citizen Genet? He's the ambassador from France, the minister from France, who's kind of responsible to get the United States to adhere to their their obligations, and we do not. So, and Genet causes a great deal of problems because he's so popular, and people respond to him, and the Republicans respond to him, and Washington gets angry with him. So Genet is sort of the problem. Or part of the problem. Now, what's interesting is, after our proclamation of neutrality, the United States finds, and so does France, that our neutrality tends to benefit the French. Now, what is Britain's response to our neutrality benefiting the French? Go ahead, Tony.
Britain starts to impress our stability.
Yes, they try to push back at that. So, we declare ourselves neutral. And the French, probably don't like this very well, but our neutrality tends to benefit France. And so the British try to shape our neutrality by violating it. Impressment, confiscating, stopping our ships, deeming trade with France to be kind of illegal. And, this becomes so flagrant and so blatant that there is kind of this call for war against Britain. And the other problem that was associated with that was that we perceived that Britain was antagonizing the Native Americans on the fort, or on the frontier. Now, rather than going to war with Britain, what does Washington, Rachel, decide to do?
Washington waits.
So Britain is doing all these things in the aftermath of Citizen Genet and our neutrality. They don't like our neutrality, and Washington is being forced and pushed to fight the British because of these various reasons. But what does he do rather than declare war?
He sends an envoy to Britain.
Yes, he sends an envoy over to try to negotiate a treaty. Now, Amanda, what treaty did that envoy eventually come up with? Jay's Treaty, and that Jay's Treaty was not very good, and it intensified the controversy. Jay's Treaty seemed like we were allowing Britain now to shape our neutrality, and we were capitulating to Britain's demands, and the Republicans violently attacked it. And it resulted in really Washington's popularity for the first time being challenged. And Washington is going to respond to that by basically retiring from office in 1796. But prior to retiring from office, Washington delivers his farewell address, which we said was significant, A, because it warned the public of the dangers of party, but it also had a diplomatic, implication to it. Washington issues certain warnings in his farewell address. What was that? Go ahead, Fisher.
He warns U.S. to stay out of European affairs.
Yes, to beware of entangling alliances with European powers. Now remember today, and again this is jumping ahead, there's a question on the test about the Monroe Doctrine, but the Monroe Doctrine is that second kind of pillar of foreign policy. So what should we do? I mean, foreign policy is our relations with other countries. And so Washington warns America, look, in your relations with European powers, don't get involved in their entangling alliances, or you'll be in the kind of mess we were with Genet and neutrality and Jay's Treaty, and if you stay out of their alliances, then you won't be in that problem. I mean, that's one warning. That's one pillar. The next pillar that the Monroe Doctrine established in 23 is, look, in terms of our relations with other countries, we consider the Western Hemisphere our sphere of influence. So other countries stay out. So these are pillars of our foreign policy, all right? So we'll come back to that in a second. Now, France was mad at Jay's Treaty because they believed that we allowed Britain to shape our neutrality, so they respond by doing the same thing. By the time France responds by doing the same thing, John Adams had been elected president, and how does he respond to the French abuses of our neutrality? Yes. 3 envoys, and those 3 envoys are less than successful. Alan, what was the eventual kind of name of the scandal associated with our 3 envoys being rejected? Do you recall, Alan? The XYZ affair. And what, Sarah, the XYZ affair, what was the upshot of it? What was the, we said the XYZ affair, what did that mean? Basically, what happened? Quickly.
They went to negotiate a treaty, but they weren't allowed to talk to them without, an operator's permit.
That's very nicely put. It was an attempt to negotiate a treaty that was spurned unless a large bribe was paid. And the American envoys returned without a treaty and an antagonized country. Remember we watched, the John Adams clip of the scary guy that was singing and, and this anti-French sentiment, explodes and Adams becomes popular. But then, the Federalists kind of take it too far by passing the Alien and Sedition Acts. What were the Alien and Sedition Acts intended to do? What were the Alien and Sedition Acts intended to do? Now, let me ask you this. The Alien and Sedition Acts were intended to kind of, protect the United States, right? I mean, we have a quasi-war with France in the aftermath of the XYZ affair, right? In the aftermath of the XYZ affair, we have this quasi-war with France, and the Alien and Sedition Acts are kind of quasi-wartime measures that are intended to silence the opposition against the government and to kind of stifle alien French that might be here, that might be considered dangerous if the war explodes into a full kind of scale war. And the Sedition Act, remember, was a violation, a clear violation of the First Amendment. But rather than taking the Sedition Act to court, Jefferson and Madison, the leaders of the opposition, how do they express their frustration and fear? It's not taking it to court, yes.
The Virginia and Kentucky resolves.
The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, or the Virginia and Kentucky resolves. Now, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are going to speak to the nature of the Constitution. And what they say is, look, the Constitution is a compact among the states. If the Constitution is a compact among the states, who then would have the final say in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of constitutionality. Not the Supreme Court, but who, Tristan? The state legislatures, right? Now remember, it is that issue that is addressed in the case of Marbury versus Madison. In Marbury versus Madison, the court declares an act of Congress unconstitutional, thus kind of establishing a precedent that it is the Supreme Court that has the final say of constitutionality. In the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Jefferson and Madison are saying, oh, no, it is state legislatures that can deem actions like the Sedition Act to be unconstitutional, which would have really strengthened the power of states and weakened the power of the national government. All right, so yes. Now, there's also a little discussion in your book about a treaty called Pinckney's Treaty with Spain. You might want to take a look at that. And there's also a little bit about just the general nature of the Republicans and the Federalists, because that's really what's happening in the 1790s, their rivalry. And you know, besides their opinions of the people, you know, the Republicans are going to venerate the common folk and the independent farmer. And the Federalists are going to kind of put confidence in the better and better educated and richer people to govern for the public good. Remember the John Jay statement that embodied federalism, and that was, the people who own the country ought to run it. Now, coming into the election of 1800, which is really kind of important, Adams's biggest problem in re-election was that he had made peace with France. That when he had the opportunity to make peace with France, he took it, and what your textbook argued was that the United States was all dressed up and nowhere to go. They had raised taxes, they had created this army and navy, and now it seemed to be less than necessary and expensive. And so the Republicans, and they had passed the Alien and Sedition Act, which seemed to be violations of people's rights, and this all results in Adams being defeated for re-election in 1800 and Thomas Jefferson being elected. Now, we really talked at length because it's just interesting about the dynamics of Burr, but there's really nothing on the test about that, right? You know, I mean, there's nothing about, you know, the tie and how it was broken, but what there is on the test is a discussion about what it meant that this was another revolution, or the revolution of 1800. And what we mean by that this was the revolution of 1800, another revolution, is that this was the real full consummation of the spirit of 1776. Now we were going to do it right? That the Federalists had gotten it wrong. They had put too much power in the hands of too few people, and they had put too much power in the hands of the people. You know, and now that the Republicans had taken the House, and the Republicans had taken the Senate, and the Republicans had won the presidency, this was going to be another revolution. And Jefferson's aspiration is to bring the Republican ideology into the federal government, which meant reducing the size, the scope, and the influence of the federal government to as small as it could possibly be. You know, at least intrusive as it possibly be, and he does this. You know, he cuts taxes and repeals the Alien Acts and replaces them and reimburses the people who were, you know, fined, and it pardons the people that were in prison, cuts the size of the diplomatic corps, the army, the navy, the size of the government, the size of the national debt. All of these things that he perceived as being problematic with, Hamilton and the Federalists, he tries to address on some level or another, and has some success in doing that. One of the other thing he tries to address is the midnight judges. The midnight judges are put on Jefferson by the Judicial Act of 1801. So we've got a Judicial Act of 1789, and now we've got a Judicial Act of 1801, which expanded the federal judiciary even further, and created all these new federal judgeships that were quickly filled by Federalists that were appointed by Adams and then confirmed by the Senate. And the most famous of those midnight judges was, in fact, John Marshall himself, who was appointed to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And as we described over the past couple of days, you know, Marshall as Chief Justice is going to dominate the Supreme Court and really kind of keep alive the spirit of federalism when it's long dead on a national level. These midnight judges were, something that frustrated Jefferson, and they tried to address that, the Republicans, by passing the Judicial Act of 1802, which cut these courts out. And also, in the case of Marbury versus Madison is a part of that battle. And we talked about that case and what it did, a moment ago. Now, one thing I would like to mention is in terms of foreign affairs, we only talked about one thing, and that was the Louisiana Purchase. And we talked about Jefferson's good fortune with the Louisiana. We even talked about that today. Then, the French acquired secretly Louisiana from Spain, and Spain, gave it to them in return for some other consideration. And once we found out about it, we tried to, basically buy, New Orleans from the French. And, France's, goals in acquiring Louisiana are thwarted when the Haitian Rebellion can't be subdued. And the end result is that France never even takes control of New Orleans, or never even takes control of Louisiana. They basically, the French, we buy it from them when they haven't even taken it yet. The Spanish put their flag down, the French put their flag up, they take it down, and we put ours up, and we give them $15 million, which is a very, very good deal. But that's not the only diplomacy that Jefferson was involved in his first term. Another thing I want you to take a look at, which we did not talk about in class, is something called the Barbary Pirates. Oh, I would want to mention this. When I'm looking at these questions, I have probably 3 or 4 of these questions are order of things, put these in order, the events in order. So I was looking at your book, and I know that you hate to do that, but I was looking at your book, and at the very end of each chapter of your book, there is a chronology, of events. Now, one of the things about that chronology is that it's when I talk about something, I talk about the chronology of something, and it's a related topic, right? It's okay, it's foreign affairs, and this is what happened, boom, boom, boom. And then we might come back to domestic affairs and say this is what happened, boom, boom, boom. But what they do in the book is they put them together, right? And I don't know if that's good or bad, but what I would suggest to you with these order questions, what came first, what came second, what came third, it might not be a bad thing to look at those 3 things. There's one at the end of chapter 10, one at the end of chapter 11, one at the end of chapter 12 that gives you the chronology to look them over. Look them over 3 times. Just try this. Just look them over 3 times. And then after you look them over 3 times, read them once, read them twice, read them 3 times. It's going to take you more than 10 minutes. Then maybe it will reinforce it in your mind. Or read something else and come back to it. Do it 3 times. Try it. And then also there is the questions themselves. So in the end of the chapters, I was looking at these questions. And like most of these questions, there's like a test question about it. So even if you just look at the topic of those questions, it would be good. All right, well anyways, okay. Quickly now, since the hour is getting late, we'll try to move forward as quickly as we can. All right, so those are order questions, and you're going to take a look at those. All right. One thing about the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson, after the deal was thrown in his lap, has a reservation, or a word that was used on the test is misgivings. No one knows what that means. Does anybody, they'll come up and say, what's this word mean? Misgiving. Misgivings means that you're not sure about something. He had misgivings about doing this. What was the source of his misgivings about such a wonderful deal? Go ahead, Alexanders.
Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the federal government can buy land, so he being a strict interpreter of that.
Yes, exactly. There's no authorization in the Constitution to make such a large land purchase. And Jefferson even considered trying to modify the Constitution to do so, but he does not. He pragmatically allows that to occur. Now, as successful as Jefferson appeared with the Louisiana Purchase, he has much more problems when war breaks out between England and France. And when it does, what we said is that both countries again try to shape our neutrality. The United States wants to be neutral, but England and France both want to shape that neutrality, and England has a more powerful navy in order to do that. So they violate our neutrality, and impressment is this big, problem that we feel is not only a violation of our neutrality, but a threat to our sovereignty and a lack of recognition of our independence. And so, really what pushes America over the edge and causes Jefferson to take a dramatic action is the Chesapeake incident. What happened there? Tony, do you recall, you are a student of the Chesapeake incident, are you not? What occurred with the Chesapeake incident?
There the troops ended up shooting,
This naval, though. It's not on the ground. The Chesapeake was an American vessel.
it was like the.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Yes, and so the Chesapeake was fired upon by the British ship, right? And they wanted to board in order to capture deserters and impressment. And in response to the Chesapeake incident, what does Jefferson do? He pushes Congress to take an action. We can't go to war. What's he do to her?
The Embargo Act?
The Embargo Act. And the Embargo Act has all of these negative ramifications that are associated with it. It decimates the economy, it reinvigorates the Federalist Party, but it does spur manufacturing. Because of the Embargo Act and the War of 1812, textile mills and iron factories spring up in New England and Pennsylvania. It is those textile mills and iron factories that Congress is going to try to protect in the aftermath of the war with tariffs. But for now, yes, the Embargo Act. And the Embargo Act is really not successful in resolving this issue. Right? I mean, Jefferson leaves office with the issue of America's neutrality unsolved. Madison takes office with this being his biggest challenge, with both France and Britain. He also is unable to solve it. And so the result is an increasing push to kind of go to war with Britain, to really force them to recognize our sovereignty, and to assert that sovereignty and independence, and to deal with what we consider to be the outstanding issues of our neutrality and problems with the Native Americans on the frontier. Now, one of the groups that were pushing this were the Warhawks. Who was the most famous of the Warhawks that were elected in 1810? This group of young congressmen. Yes, go ahead, Alexander. Henry Clay of Kentucky. Also John C. Calhoun. But the Warhawks were Republicans. They were Republican nationalists, mostly from the West and from the South. And they push, Madison for an eventual declaration of war. And Madison invites Congress to debate it, and Congress decides by not a wide margin to declare war on England. What sections of the country were most likely to support the war, and what section of the country was most likely to oppose it? Go ahead, Matt. Yeah, ironically, landlocked parts of the country like the West would support it, and the South as well. And what, ironically, part of the country opposed the war? The ports, and in particularly New England and the Northeast, they opposed the war. And so the result was that the war kind of starts. And one of the things that we argued is the Americans were just horribly, horribly unprepared. They had reduced the size of the army, they hadn't raised taxes, they didn't have a significant navy, they were divided and horribly unprepared, and they had unclear objectives, and they stumbled into this conflict with the greatest power on the earth, England at the time. But the advantage that they had is England was entirely kind of immersed in the Napoleonic Wars, and they thought it would be easy, and it wasn't. Now, there are not a lot of questions about the actual fighting of the war, but there is a question or two about the naval success of the United States in the War of 1812, and in particular the Battle of Put in Bay. Oliver Hazard Perry, we have met the enemy and he is ours, clearing Lake Erie, that's a significant battle. But probably the most important and interesting battle of the War of 1812 was the Battle of New Orleans. And Fisher, what was so darn interesting about that battle?
It took place after the war
ended. It took place after the war ended. And it's success of Andrew Jackson and Americans at New Orleans is what convinces Americans that they'd actually won the war. That the Treaty of Ghent, and what did the Treaty of Ghent, what were the terms that we ended the war on? We do end the war before the Battle of New Orleans on what terms? Go ahead. Yes, the way it was before the war, status quo antebellum, which hardly seems like a victory, but it was perceived as such because of the timing of the announcements. And so, the Battle of New Orleans is also the catalyst of this spirit of nationalism that we have been talking about for the past couple of days. Hey, what was the Hartford Convention and how did that fit into the whole picture? Sam, do you recall anything of the Hartford Convention, and where is your best friend Sidewalk? Why is he not here?
I probably working.
Well, did you recall anything of the Hartford Convention?
I don't, but I'm sure Tony does.
Tony does. Tony, your ex-friend Sam just said, did you have a recollection of the Hartford
Well,
Convention?
that was where, wasn't it, North England?
New England.
New England.
Yeah, that's right.
New England, weren't they, wasn't it Federalist?
Yes, the Federalists in New England called this convention.
To discuss like problems with like the Embargo Act?
Yeah, with the embargo and the war. And really what the Hartford Convention was an attempt to do is for New England to get some way of protecting themselves for things like the embargo and the war, and a federal government that would pass. But what was the result of the Hartford Convention for the Federalists? Yes?
It was that during the previous day, list of changes that was in the Constitution.
Yes, and when they presented them, they were perceived as being disloyal and out of touch with the spirit of nationalism. And so the Hartford Convention led to the demise of the Federalist Party and the emergence of the era of good feelings. In addition to that, it was also the Republicans embracing so many of the Federalist ideas that lead to the demise of federalism as well, and the emergence of the era of good feelings. What was the name of the treaty that provided for the United States to acquire Florida from Spain? Yes. Adams-Amish Treaty. And what was the source of the panic of, if you were going to describe in just a few words what caused the panic of 1819, what would you say?
Over-speculation of Western lands.
Yes, over-speculation of Western lands is an excellent way of putting that. We talked about McCulloch versus Maryland, and the Missouri Compromise, the last question on the test. What was the source of the controversy there in the Missouri Compromise? Yes. Slavery, yeah. And it was slavery into Missouri. What was the big, the end of the Missouri Compromise, which we'll do tomorrow since it won't be there, was Maine free, Missouri enslaved, and this is the big part. Yes, go ahead, Matt. Yes, no slavery above the 36th line. All right. There you go, right at 3:25, that's good. This may be on the YouTube, and you could, anything that we mentioned probably is a test question. So if you noted that, that's good.
Mr. Wallace, should I stop this thing?
I guess.
Calling for a first.